So we're gonna dive into this, John. So let's talk about like what is the Darwinian problem of evil, and like why should we care about it?
Well, it, to put it really simply, if you think that species were created and designed by means of evolution, as a theory initiated by Darwin, and then has evolved over time, it looks like that's a method of creation or designing species, bringing about species that while it's very successful, it's brought us about, according to the theory, it brought complex life about and all kinds of good things about. But along with it, one of the main byproducts of it has been a magnitude of suffering that is really kind of hard to imagine, especially if we think about it in terms of the deep time, planetary time that geologists have revealed. Really, about the last 2.5 centuries, modern geologists, have made us aware that the Earth is vastly older than anyone imagined. But along with that discovery came a secondary discovery of life forms that had existed, entire species, really entire ecologies. Some have referred to them as worlds, entire worlds of plants and animals and biomes have come and gone, so that at the end, as we speak, biologists tell us that 99.9% of all species that ever existed are gone. And an awful lot of them without any trace of a genetic legacy. So you can't even argue that, say, the reason for their existence was to contribute to a progeny or to descendants. This looks to a lot of people, especially atheistic people, as so wasteful, inefficient, and if you think animals are capable of actual suffering in a moral way, cruel. And so it becomes very hard for some people to believe that an all powerful and all wise and morally perfect God would create nature this way and design the conditions of existence for animals in that fashion. And some people go further and they'll see what we're talking about here, this Darwinian problem, the whole configuration of animal suffering that's been unveiled, as almost proof positive that there is no such God. So this is a problem of evil that impinges on the larger discussion about God and evil and evidence for and against belief in theistic God, and in this case, I'm more concerned with a distinctly Christian God.
Yeah,
And
that's super helpful.
that's just part of the problem. And when we could go on to talk about discoveries in modern biology involving the unveiling of an entire world of, I call them micro monsters, viruses, microbial diseases, various parasites, organisms whose at least most obvious role in nature is to inflict immense harm, disease, and death, intense suffering on innocent creatures. And so there's, at best on its surface or on its face, a real problem there in seeing it as plausible that the Christian God would have designed things that way. So obviously, if as a Christian you want to affirm Darwinian evolution, that God in fact did create that way, then it falls on you to give some kind of explanation as to how that's plausible, how those two things could be reconciled. The picture of God on the one hand, and then this configuration of animal suffering on the other. And that's apart from the human suffering that many of these things have caused, since human beings arrived in the picture on the stage of time. And so those are two aspects of the problem. And in the book I go into it even more deeply because one of my concerns in the book, well, one of my reasons for writing the book is I think some evolutionary creationists, as they often call themselves, that is, people who believe God created the world but did so by means of Darwinian evolution, are somewhat downplaying the complexity and seriousness of the problem. Maybe treating it a little too casually as not that big a problem, and that is something I want to avoid. I want to stress that in the interest of honesty, integrity, credibility, that Christian thinkers should face this problem full on. And that includes an aesthetic aspect, as you looked at the book and you know that is a part of the problem. I call attention to something that's been ignored, really, or at least explicitly missing from the conversation, and that's the aspect of horror. You know, some of the things that we find in nature better fit philosophical descriptions of that genre than the merely tragic one or unpleasant one. And I give examples in the book of little creatures that do terrible, terrible things to animals. And you know, those those would make great horror films. In fact, a lot of the creatures that we've discovered resemble some of the creatures that we find in horror films. So it goes beyond just ordinary evil into something extraordinary. So once my view is that once one grasps the multi-layered nature of the problem and its atheistic force, that it's really very difficult to downplay it, and of course very, very difficult to explain all this very well. And my sense was that while people have made very heroic efforts to do so, in my judgment at least, none of the available explanations is good enough to really obviate the need for further searching for a better alternative if we can find one. And that was my goal in writing the book, is to find an approach to this that would improve the position of Christians in this conversation beyond what had already been achieved by people who've written on it.